Welcome back to the final day of the Rural Progress Summit. We have a great panel of experts here to discuss the future of rural connectivity, something that we've been talking about in rural America for a long, long time. Specifically, how spectrum policy made in DC impacts rural America from farms to factories. If you've been following the negotiations leading up to the OBBB, you will certainly have heard the word spectrum come up quite a lot. And as the negotiations swirled around reconciliation bill in Congress, which we now have completed reconciliation, but we also have many, many opportunities in Congress to begin to have this discussion about rural broadband and rural spectrum. This issue was a major sticking point for members of Congress as it has incredible critical impacts on defense, manufacturing, precision agriculture, healthcare, and pretty much every sector of rural America. We can't be left behind. But what about spectrum, and how does this policy affect rural connectivity? Those are some of the key questions our expert panel will dive in today. I'm going to quickly ask you all to introduce yourself, and we will get right into a PowerPoint presentation that Dave's prepared, and then have an excellent conversation after that. So Dave, we'll start with you, then Steve, then Mark. Give us a quick intro, why you ended up on this panel, and then we can get into the dialogue. So Dave, we'll start with you.
Great. Thank you, Senator Heitkamp, and thank you to the One Country Project for inviting me to participate. So I'm Dave Wright. I'm the Policy Director with Spectrum for the Future. I've been working in the technology and networking space for over 30 years, which seems impossible, but it's true. And I've been working on wireless technologies and spectrum policy specifically for about the last 15 to 20 years. Initially in corporate roles, and then I've also served as the president of the OnGo Alliance, which was a big organization promoting CBRS, and now obviously serving with Spectrum for the Future. So excited for our discussion.
Thanks, Dave. Hi, I'm Steve Karan. I'm a lawyer at Lerman Center in Washington, D.C., which is a telecommunications boutique that's been around for 40 plus years. I also serve as outside regulatory counsel to WISPA, Broadband Without Boundaries, which represents rural broadband providers across the country that deploy broadband on spectrum as well as fiber. WISPA was one of the leaders in promoting the origination of the Citizens Broadband radio service that we're going to be talking about today. And that's where Dave and I first met, probably about 10 years ago. So, and my experience goes back a little further than that. So great to be with you all. Thank you, Senator, and thank you, One Country Project.
Thanks, Steve. Mark?
I'm up. Okay. I'm Mark Houtz. I am the person that's actually implementing this in the rural areas. I'm part of the Utah Education and Telehealth Network. I work for a smaller organization underneath them, but I work with them. My job is deploying. We've been playing with CBRS and private cellular for about 7 to 10 years. We've been looking at this through using different bands of spectrum. We've been playing this game of losing spectrum to auctions and getting spectrum taken away for quite a while. So we've been looking to build this network to reach students in their homes. Became a big deal during COVID when everybody suddenly had to go work from home, and everybody was using the home internet pipe that was very small. So we've been building this network to reach those kids and then we found a bunch of other use cases, but that's been our primary when we started with this use case that we went down the road with. So it's great. I'm glad to be here. So.
Great. And Dave, we're going to have you turn it over and explain what this spectrum issue is and why it's so significant to rural America.
All right. So without further ado, I'm going to try to take you through everything you need to know about spectrum and the CBRS band in 15 minutes, which is virtually impossible, but we're going to do our best. So, why is this important? What is spectrum? What are you guys here to talk to us about? At a high level, radio frequency spectrum, it's the lifeblood of every wireless service So, whether it's a cellular service, Wi-Fi, GPS, farm sensors, new wireless factory automation systems, all of this uses radio frequency spectrum. And those are just really commercial, some of the commercial applications. When you think about how the government uses spectrum, it's everything from military radars to weather observation and forecasting to space exploration, communications, military communications, police communications, et cetera. So, there's a range of commercial uses, there's a range of government uses of spectrum. And without spectrum, there is no wireless, right? So spectrum is a finite resource. There's a certain amount of it. It's all around us in the air, if you will. But the way we meter it or measure it is in megahertz and gigahertz, right? And there's a frequency range. I just included an example here on the slide to show from about 2.4 to call it 7 gigahertz. In this frequency range, what have we got? And it's the range of things I just talked about. It's different government services, it's different commercial services, and then there's actually some shared stuff in there as well. But it is a finite resource. It's highly coveted, increasingly coveted, particularly in call it the mid bands, which is where people want to operate today because spectrum tends to have different physics properties. You can push a lot of data through a higher frequency, but you get very short propagation distance with a higher frequency. Whereas at a low frequency, like down at the bottom of this range, you'd be able to go further, but transmit less data, if you will. So those are some of the trade-offs you'll find. But suffice it to say, it's very highly coveted these days. And the way that we manage a spectrum in this country is essentially there's two different agencies that handle it. Commercial spectrum is managed by the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC. That's what their purview is. Government spectrum, so federally operated spectrum, is managed by the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, which is part of the Department of Commerce. And so there's a tight relationship between the FCC and the NTIA as they balance commercial and federal needs. On the commercial side, so just focusing on the commercial side, historically, spectrum has been allocated in one of two ways. It's really been allocated as either exclusive use, typically high power licensed spectrum. So the FCC would conduct an auction, they'd see who showed up to bid on these licenses, and then through the auction process, somebody would make the highest bid and be awarded that license ultimately. So that was sort of the first thing that was done. And then in about the 85 timeframe, some really forward-thinking people at the FCC decided, hey, what if we made spectrum just available for essentially anyone to use? And so they took some spectrum in the 2.4 gigahertz range, as I'm showing here on the slide, and they made it available as unlicensed spectrum, meaning essentially that anybody could utilize the spectrum as long as they abided by certain baseline rules. But there was no auction. You didn't have to get a license. Literally, you could just go and get equipment, and as long as the equipment was compliant, you could operate in the band. So that's what we've had historically, licensed on one side, unlicensed on the other side. And what we're going to be talking a lot about today is essentially a new paradigm that allows us to not necessarily have to get rid of government users, but actually share spectrum between the government and the commercial side, which is what we've done with the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS, as Steve mentioned. And on the commercial services that we've introduced, it mixes both this protected rights that you get with licensed spectrum and an opportunistic access component, which historically was associated with unlicensed spectrum, although it's not unlicensed in the CBRS context. So kind of cool what we've done. It's really ushered in a whole new era of services and service capability, and we'll talk about that. In terms of why spectrum is important to rural communities, the whole world is increasingly wireless, but I would say spectrum really plays an outsized role in rural communities because it can be difficult to put in physical infrastructure. There are challenges, whether they're economic or just, literally laying fiber or copper in the ground. So, the broadband services that Mark alluded to, if you can deliver that with a wireless service, that's the way a lot of rural, both residences and businesses get their internet access. And then CBRS is particularly important for agriculture and for factories. So rural farming, rural factories, rural manufacturing, all of this is really being spurred by CBRS. So with that, not going to spend a lot of time on this. Who is Spectrum for the Future? It's an organization really looking to promote this dynamic sharing paradigm, which I'm about to describe with CBRS. We support all types of spectrum. We think licensed is important. We think unlicensed is important, but we think this new paradigm with sharing spectrum and localized cellular is very important. Pretty broad range of members, covering a bunch of different ecosystems or sectors, but I specifically point out schools, libraries, rural connectivity, manufacturing, and agriculture here. You can see some of the other ones as well, but I think those are most pertinent to this discussion. Don't be too frightened when you see this slide. I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through the details of it. The key takeaways here are that, again, CBRS is really a whole new animal in terms of how we do spectrum access. We're moving beyond just this bipolar, it's licensed or it's unlicensed, to oh, wait, we can actually share spectrum, and we don't need to kick out the government incumbent users who are shown here as tier 1 users. So this is the military, both naval systems as well as some ground-based systems, that we are protecting them. All the commercial operations essentially work around the government operations. So they have the highest protection rates in the system. And then we've introduced these 2 new tiers of commercial service, tier 2 and tier 3. We call the tier 2 service priority access, or PAL, and the tier 3 is general authorized access, or GAA. You'll hear it referred to. The important thing here is that PAL has essentially a protected right to spectrum, almost exclusive use of the spectrum. You have to go through you had to go through an auction to secure those rights. That auction was held in 2020, in the summer of 2020. But going down to tier 3, what's the point here is that any spectrum that's not being used by the tier 1 incumbents or by the priority access licensees, and there was a limit on how much of the spectrum was available to the priority access licensees, any spectrum that's not being used at either tier 1 or tier 2 becomes available to tier 3. So this is opportunistic. Steve is going to glare at me, but it is not unlicensed. It is licensed by rule, but it shares some of the characteristics of unlicensed spectrum in that it has extremely low barriers to entry. Essentially, anybody can play at the GAA tier, which makes it much more like an unlicensed service like we know historically with Bluetooth or Wi-Fi. Last thing I'm going to make a point of on this slide is that the spectrum range, or the frequency range, from 3550 to 3700 megahertz. This is a globally harmonized frequency range for cellular technologies. Historically, LTE is operated here, and more recently 5G operates here, and not just in the US, but in Europe and in Asia. So there's a global ecosystem of equipment available for this. And what we're doing is we're really democratizing cellular technologies by allowing anybody to deploy. Mark was mentioning that they've been looking at ways to deploy cellular systems for a while, and this gives school districts and really anybody else who wants to the opportunity to deploy those technologies really for the first time in the US. So due to that flexibility, CBRS is really the epitome of flexible use spectrum, is the term of art. At a high level, these are sort of 5 broad categories of use that I like to point out or highlight. The 3 on the far left are essentially service provider led. The mobile operators do use this spectrum to augment the capacity of their existing licensed spectrum holdings that they have. So Verizon and AT&T are big users of CBRS. Alternative mobile footprint, this is essentially people who want to offer their own cellular services as a public mobile network offering in competition to the traditional mobile carriers. They're using CBRS for that. So this would be the cable companies who have dense fiber and copper footprint in metro areas. They're deploying CBRS to onboard the subscribers for their mobile offerings. So both Charter and Comcast and others now have mobile offerings, and so they're using CBRS for that. Fixed wireless access, this is one we'll be talking about much more on the panel. So this is using CBRS to deliver a broadband connection to a residence or to a business. very important in a rural context. So those are the service provider led. On the right, you've got private networks and in-building cellular. In-building cellular is sort of a way to do neutral host DAS stuff inside of a building. Not really pertinent to our discussion, not going to focus on it. But private networking, that's one of the things that CBRS has really enabled. And this is the ability to deploy an LTE or now a 5G network and use it for the internal connectivity needs of a business, a school, a manufacturer, a farm, everything from, again, manufacturing lines to farm sensors. John Deere is now, using this both for their own manufacturing equipment, but also looking at it as a way to provide connectivity to their equipment in a precision agriculture context going forward. So again, range of uses. We'll show some of the stats later on how things have gone in the band, and it's because of that range of use that we've seen such good uptake. Two quick examples. We know this is from farm to factory, so I thought two quick examples in those use cases specifically. So 5G Smart Factory, this is Ericsson, actually down in Texas, has deployed 5G within their 5G manufacturing facility. And again, they're using this to do redeployable, reconfigurable assembly lines, and proven itself to be quite good in terms of the ROI they've seen on that. Other major manufacturing that we've seen with CBRS would include automotive. There are a number of automotive manufacturers using CBRS, both within the assembly lines, but also out on the ramp where they stage the vehicles to upload firmware and things like this. Microelectronics manufacturing, so a range of companies are using this. Agriculture, so again, smart ag is a big use for it. One of the things about CBRS is because it uses cellular technologies and it allows for a little bit higher power than we can do with Wi-Fi, you get better range with a CBRS solution than you will with a comparable Wi-Fi solution. So if you're trying to cover a 700-acre farm or something like that, CBRS is very effective for doing that, connecting sensors, connecting farm machinery, etc. So this is the example from First Greenery in Missouri. CBRS success story. I'm mindful of time. I'm going to try and wrap this soon. Because of the flexibility, we have over 1,000 different entities operating in the band, both at the GAA and the PAL tier. Over 410,000 what we call CBSDs have been deployed. And a CBSD is essentially a CBRS base station. So that's comparable to the total number of macro mobile cell sites that have been deployed throughout all of history. And we launched CBRS in January of 2020. So this has happened essentially in 5.5 years. We've deployed 410,000 CBSDs. And these stats are largely based on an NTIA report that came out in July of last year. No, pardon me. It was through July of last year. It came out in the fall, just so you know the source. But they showed that 67.5% of these base stations are deployed in rural counties. So I think that's a nice stat here for this panel. Almost all of the CBSDs utilize the GAA tier of spectrum, so 95%. About a quarter of them also use the PAL, and a CBSD doesn't have to use one or the other. It could use both, which is why there's some overlap there with the 95 and the 100. But it shows you how important that opportunistic GAA access is. It's extensively used throughout the country, 82.7% of all counties, and in 41% of counties, all 15 channels, so all 150 megahertz is being utilized. It's been very important to creating innovation. These are all small U.S. companies that have formed around opportunities that have been created because of CBRS. And as Mark mentioned earlier, and I'm sure we'll discuss more, it really demonstrated its value and its flexibility during the COVID pandemic, both in a healthcare context and in the educational context. We did an auction in July of 2020, as I mentioned, of the PAL, the Tier 2. It was the most widely participated auction in FCC history by far. 257 bidders, 20,000 plus licenses were awarded. Of the winning entities, I think there were 228 entities that actually received licenses. Of those, 115 were designated entities, meaning they were small, rural, and or women-owned businesses, utilities, universities, industrials, etc. And one of the things I would point out here is that, again, because we did the licenses at a smaller geographic level, they were county-sized licenses instead of what are called partial economic areas, which are huge areas. Because they were smaller licenses geographically, they they went for a lot less in the rural areas, right? So that really opened up the opportunity for rural schools, rural manufacturers, rural farms, rural WISPs to obtain these licenses at costs of thousands of dollars versus the historical licensing cost of millions of dollars, right? So that's what you would see with all the kind of purplish shading on this map. Those were licenses that went in the somewhere between $1,000 to $10,000, and a lot of them went to smaller players and rural players. So, because of all of this goodness that I've talked about, there's a ton of people that are doing things in CBRS. This is a little bit of an eye chart, and I apologize, but it's really just to show you the kinds of companies that are involved, and it's everything from people making equipment on the client side to people making infrastructure equipment. Most importantly, probably, I think, for this discussion is the list of folks who are actually using the spectrum and using CBRS technology. And it includes a bunch of education, includes a bunch of agriculture interests, but you'll also see different manufacturing. Deer would be an example, as well as oil and gas production, energy distribution, higher ed, sports, stadiums, et cetera, et cetera. The NFL actually uses this now for the coach to field communication system, in most of the stadiums. So all sorts of interesting things we're doing here. Finally, what we kind of want to really talk to you about today is the OBBB, right? One big beautiful bill, some of the spectrum provisions there. At a high level, I'll just set up the discussion by saying what the One Big Beautiful Bill does is it restores the FCC's auction authority, which had lapsed. So that's been restored for a period of 10 years. And then it calls for 800 megahertz of spectrum to be mid-band spectrum, so between 1.3 and 10.5 gigahertz, to be auctioned for high power exclusive use by 2035. And that's because this was all done as part of the reconciliation process. So it's really only supposed to be addressing fiscal, budgetary matters. And so they're looking at those auction revenues as ways to offset other spending that's in the bill, right? So that's why that's sort of the narrow scope. But what that tells you is it sort of leaves out the spectrum that's mostly of interest to me and Mark and Steve, which would be on the shared dynamic sharing like CBRS and or unlicensed side like we use for Wi-Fi, right? That's really not, there's nothing in the bill promoting those types of spectrum. Of that 800 megahertz of spectrum that needs to be auctioned, 300 megahertz of it is to come from commercial sources. And so there's a little concern that, is CBRS and or some of the Wi-Fi bands in jeopardy there. They did say 100 megahertz specifically has to come from upper C-band, which we can talk about. 500 megahertz is to come from federal sources, period, full stop. And then there was a carve out that it cannot come from 3100 to 3450 or 7400 to 8400. And that was what a lot of the contention was about, was protecting those specific frequency bands. There's also some rule of construction, which is sort of guidance language, if you will, indicating that existing commercial services like Wi-Fi or CBRS should not be relocated into those protected federal bands, so 3100 to 3450 and 7400 to 8400. We have concern about what this bill will mean as the FCC takes it for action and the NTIA take it for action in terms of, how does that potentially impact both CBRS and Wi-Fi services.
Thanks so much. And I know this seems maybe to some of the folks watching this to be highly technical, but this is really significant. When I left the Senate, we were just looking at laying more cable, laying more fiber. And this is a whole brave new world of opportunity, but also a whole brave new world of competition for who's going to get the spectrum. I think one of the most significant things Dave talked about is that this resource is finite. Now, it may not be finite into the future, depending upon technology, but as it relates today. And so, Steve, I want you to give us your opinion. You follow this very closely. The big beautiful bill kind of provisions as it relates to spectrum. What are the positives for rural America, and what are the concerns in that bill for rural America today?
So thanks. Let me focus on the positives. I suppose the positives is that we now have spectrum authority until September of 2034. That's something that has lapsed for a couple of years, and that's an opportunity for companies to get more spectrum, whether it's for fixed purposes or for mobile purposes. And it's also an opportunity for the government to raise money. This is, if I remember correctly, this is the first time that a bill has ever said auction revenues should be considered as part of the process. There was sort of under 309J of the Communications Act, that was sort of off limits. So we've now removed the fig leaf, and because we all know that auction revenues is important, but here we're actually trying to, solve a reconciliation project. I suppose another thing that is somewhat positive is we know what the targets are that NTIA and the FCC need to shoot at, and it's not being left entirely to the discretion of the FCC. Although I will say the FCC has a lot of discretion in auction design and the timing of auctions and working with NTIA to identify those bands. So those are kind of some of the positives. I would say some of the concerns are, CBRS and the Wi-Fi band at 6 gigahertz are at risk because we've got to find 300 megahertz of commercial spectrum to repurpose. 100 megahertz at least is going to come from that upper C band, but we don't know where the other 200 megahertz is going to come from. And I don't think that people expect that it's going to be coming from the spectrum that AT&T, Verizon, and T-Mobile are already using right now. So hope that's responsive.
Yeah, well, I think it is, and so I'm going to turn to you, Mark. You've heard this. You're an implementer. You're not a policy guy who's looking at this saying, "What should we be doing going forward?" This is your lifeblood. This is your link to doing things, maybe saving a little money in the process, but also you've been innovative in this whole area. What concerns you about this bill, and what do you see as the changes since you've been in this work? What changes have you seen, and what do those mean for increased opportunities, especially for rural schools?
So fear for me comes down to losing this. This has been promised. We have PAL licenses. We have these different things. We might lose it. That's where the fear really comes. There's a lot of fear across the industry. I've talked to so many people that are, because it's uncertain. Where is the spec? It's a finite service, and so we're very much going, where is this bill going to pull from? Well, there's these two options that are very, very right in the crosshairs of where this is coming from, being given to the carriers. Yeah, it's for them to make money off of, and there's all that benefit. Ultimately, at the end of the day, when it comes down to what we've been building, we've watched this process before. The education broadband service or something, broadcast service, EBS, and BRS Spectrum Band 41. That was auctioned off a few years ago. Similar fashion. Used in the 60s, it was dedicated to education. Education didn't usually use it very wisely. Just kind of sat there very lightly used. And so they found it as a spectrum that they could take away from education and sold to the carriers. We're looking at the same thing here. We have this project where we were going down the route with EBS. We lost that. So then we were pushed to CBRS. Now we're going to lose CBRS and Wi-Fi. There's nothing else for us to move to. And so it's very concerning that we're going to lose access to this connectivity that is currently being used by organizations around the country. It's going to lock us into relying on the carriers. There's some privacy issues that come with this. There's people that do not want their data crossing carrier networks, but because we don't have spectrum, with how limited Wi-Fi is, ultimately we have to rely on the carriers. There's a lot of data that is very, very private that organizations do not want crossing there. There's lots of issues when it comes to this. That's more than just money. It's all about funding. But there's things that this was promised to organizations in this country, and now they're looking to take it away. And it's just kind of it's almost killing this industry. We have all those startups that kind of jumped into this put all the funding in, went down the route, let's build this, we got product, have product out there. If we get moved or other things like that, that starts the process over. We're 10 years behind. CBRS has been established. We have products that I can buy right now off the shelf in our phones and different things that are supported by it. If we get forced to a different band of spectrum, we're 10 years out from getting that into devices again. So there's lots of little issues that come from this, that by kicking people out of this band and saying, oh, we'll just move them over here and then they'll adapt, well, you're going to put the whole industry to have to spend billions of dollars to move, and buy all new equipment, that whole piece, in addition to all this. And so it's very much concerning for those that have jumped on board with this, if we're going to lose it.
The one thing that I want to say, and Dave, I'm going to turn to you because I know a little bit about reconciliation. You don't get to do this unless it's about money, right? And so now all of a sudden the federal government is looking at this incredible asset that belongs to all of us, right? This is not, the federal government is not an enterprise institute. It's not there to make profit. It's there to do public good. And it seems to me that when you look at this, and you can agree or disagree, that the money has driven this. So we have a valuable asset. And so all of those, democratization of the spectrum, which is, look, we don't have to go out and buy this service. We can create a network. As long as we have spectrum, we can do amazing things for lower cost. But now it's kind of like, well, but we really want to create almost I shouldn't say this, but a monopolistic kind of situation for the providers. And so, agree or disagree with me, Dave, on the concern?
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more. I for a long time I have been concerned that, and I understand why the reality is the reality, but I think the fixation on auction revenues as pay-fors or offsets for other spending, that different members of Congress and senators would like to see happen. It's just not the right way to view this resource. As you said, this is a public national resource that provides all kinds of benefits to all kinds of people. Again, just don't forget, not just commercial. I mean, that was one of the big fights. Again, was over these the 3100 to 3450 and the 7400 to 8400 that got carved out, right? Those cannot be repurposed from federal to commercial. And that was because a few senators who are really defense and intelligence oriented said, whoa, we cannot take that away. We need that for the military. We need that for our intelligence agencies. And they're right. I mean, these are important things. And those, what revenue does that generate to the Treasury? $0. But they're important, and we all know they're important. And Mark's application with his schools are important. And Steve's members' uses of this to provide rural, broadband connectivity are very important. And oh, by the way, all the industrial and manufacturing examples that I was talking about, I mean, that's sort of underpinning this whole idea that we need to repatriate manufacturing to this country. Because when you talk about 21st century manufacturing in 2025 and 2026, it's all about automation. It's not just people on assembly lines now, it's robots, and a lot of those you don't want to, physically wire in. You want to be able to move them around within the factory as your assembly lines change. So wireless is the technology of choice. And the best way that people can do that today is with CBRS, because they can do it themselves. They don't have to work with a carrier, like Mark was alluding to. And that's why, BMW and Samsung and Hyundai and John Deere are using this in their manufacturing. So, we need to get back to a place where we look at, in my view, we look at what is the societal contribution, GDP contribution of spectrum, not just what can I get at an auction of that spectrum. And there's been some good reports on the unlicensed spectrum side, looking at the GDP contribution, and it's, I think, in the trillions of dollars now, annually to the U.S. So There you go.
Incredibly important discussion that we're having here. So, Steve, I'm going to turn to you because there's some people out there who say, well, it seems like now we've given the FCC a lot of authority. They're going to be making decisions. If I don't have someone, if Mark doesn't have someone in Washington, D.C., that's going to look out for his interest, and if we've politicized the FCC, as we know we have, what can people do? Number one, give us an outline on where we are right now with the makeup of the FCC, whether there is anyone in the pipeline for these positions, and then how can an average citizen, especially someone in rural America, whether it's a small manufacturer, whether it is a small school, whether it is a coalition of rural schools, how can they play a role in making sure that that their interests are heard before the FCC?
So the current makeup of the FCC is the chairman is Brendan Carr, who has been at the FCC for many, many years and served as a commissioner for 7 years before being named by President Trump to be the chairman. The second Republican of the three commissioners is Olivia Trusty, whom I'm sure you know, and has worked on the Hill for many years. And she was just seated a couple of weeks ago and has filled out her staff as well. The lone Democrat is Ana Gomez, who has been in the private sector, worked at NTIA, worked at the FCC, and she's been very outspoken about some of the things that the Republican majority are doing. There are currently three commissioners. The FCC has an allocation of 5. The quorum is 3 for most things. It's uncertain whether the other 2, which would go to a Republican and a Democrat under most circumstances, are going to be named, or if the FCC will just proceed with the 3 commissioners that they have. What can citizens do? There is an open proceeding involving the Citizens Broadband Radio Service at the FCC. The docket started sometime last year, and comments were filed, I want to say, towards the end of 2024. Things kind of, I wouldn't say they've slowed down. They've slowed down publicly, but I think things will start to ramp up a bit more now that the FCC has been tasked with identifying additional spectrum and it has its auction authority back. One thing that you're going to hear from the big mobile providers, and they've said this, is that this band is not a success. And they base success because, well, we didn't get any spectrum. Everybody else did. And that, I think, is their measure of what success is. The other thing to keep an eye on is T-Mobile has spectrum at 2.5. That's sort of their home. AT&T is locking in at 3.45 to 3.55 just to the south of CBRS. And Verizon is just to the north. And so they certainly have an interest in bridging that 150 megahertz gap that we call CBRS and turning it into a higher power 5G mobile band so that they can, harmonize their services. So that's why CBRS is in the crosshairs.
To me, this is it's a really interesting discussion because, and I'm going to turn to you, Mark. You raised in your comments the fact that you've bought equipment, you relied on kind of this spectrum being available, you have kind of arranged it, and now the uncertainty, the investment, what does that mean? It seems to me that you've been incredibly innovative as you've looked at an opportunity here to, number one, reduce costs for the school district, but also protect privacy, all of the things that come with your own control. How concerned are you now that the innovation that you went through, and that it will just throw cold water if they think, okay, you can do all of this, you get really excited about innovation, but down the line somebody's going to pull the rug out from underneath you, and so this idea of innovation in this space becomes kind of phony because we're just relying on providers.
Absolutely. In this industry, very, very technical, trying to avoid the technicalities here. But how the technology works is understood by the carriers. Your genuine populace know how Wi-Fi works. They love Wi-Fi. We're great with Wi-Fi. but this technology is not understood at that level. And that's a understanding that is just held deeply by the carriers. This has opened up the ability for people in these other industries to start to understand this technology, which makes their usage of cellular technology and the carriers networks better. That has been a huge innovation that we've seen. I've helped many people understand this technology, and then they can go build their own networks. When by losing this, that takes that power away for that understanding that I need to understand this because I could build my own networks to, well, I just rely on the carriers. I just let the carriers take care of it. I just pay them a fee and they take care of it. But are they going to build a tower inside of my building in my basement where I have no coverage? No, because it's going to cost them way too much money. And so they're relying on Wi-Fi or other things, but then we might be losing some of those things. And so there's this whole challenge that we're looking at of going, are we building, are we innovating, are we looking to the future on what's coming and being able to provide for those innovations that are coming? Are we providing for students to go, here's the technology, go play with it? In our schools, we are actually looking at teaching students these technologies to help build them so they can go be the engineers that work for these cellular companies, because there's not a funnel of students coming out of school going that way. We're trying to help the carriers build that. How do we build that? By having an option that they can play with at school versus, well, we have to go get a license and a special permission from AT&T or T-Mobile or Verizon to go play with this technology. And so if we want some innovation, the carriers are going to all day long say that CBRS has been a failure. It's not been widely used. It's not been widely rolled out. That's largely a lie. They really want the higher power. In all honesty, Verizon has used CBRS. They've used these bands. They have some PAL licenses. They've used GAA even in some places before they got their C-band. But at the end of the day, they have been using this. If it's not a success, why have they been using this? And so innovation, as a country, we're looking at innovation. We're looking, what's the future? What's coming? Spectrum is one of those things. How many devices in our lives now are relying on wireless, whether that's Wi-Fi or cellular? Everything is going wireless. And so at the end of the day, innovation, that's where the innovation is. If we limit ourselves and take this away and just sell it to the carriers to where we have to pay for it, that actually limits our innovation.
One of the things that, and again, this is not my area of expertise, but it's fascinating. Your discussion has been incredibly fascinating for me. But when you look at vulnerability, right? So if you only have 4 or 5 carriers throughout the country, we have a system that relies on, we saw the tragedy in Texas. We see that the need to have local warnings, to have local control over this powerful communications tool. Are we less, and I'm just going to address you, Dave, are we more vulnerable by putting all of our eggs in big baskets as opposed to kind of parceling them out in these innovation baskets and these baskets of local control?
Thank you for the question. I'm going to kind of give you 2 answers because there's 2 ways I think about the question. The first would be in the context you just mentioned, which is disaster response and things like that. And yes, there have been, when you have historic level disasters, and I'd certainly say the Kern County stuff in Texas, rises to that level. I'm thinking Katrina and other things. Oftentimes the outages and the disruption to service can this isn't a matter of hours. We're talking days, weeks, sometimes months, right? So what we've seen in many of those cases is, yes, to their credit, AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon, they get in there, and if their battery backups run out or their generators run out, they get in there with replacement systems as soon as they can. But having democratized access to spectrum and wireless technology allows the people on the ground just to respond right themselves. And you see, people setting up Wi-Fi hotspots. They happen to have a broadband connection that's working, or somebody brings in a satellite backhaul for broadband. You put a Wi-Fi hotspot around that, and the community suddenly has connectivity again. They're able to text their relatives to let them know they're alive. I mean, literally, that this has happened, right? And you've got good organizations. There's a group called the IT Disaster Response Center, ITDRC, and they specialize in this, right? They go in on the ground after one of these big disasters, and yes, they'll use cellular. They specifically will use it for backhaul, but they predominantly are deploying Wi-Fi as the access technology, because when people show up with the laptop to check their email or to email a relative, it doesn't have a 5G or an LTE radio. It has a Wi-Fi radio in it, right? So yes, I think from a resiliency perspective, you need both. You need the cellular systems for the wide area coverage, but giving people the ability to react themselves and communities to do that, especially in a rural context where they may be on their own for some period of time. I think that's phenomenally important, and that's what again, services using unlicensed and or shared spectrum can do. If I could also take it to are we putting too many eggs in a small basket, or yeah, I think that's the right analogy. I'd also think about it from a national security perspective. And one of the things that concerns me is this overemphasis on exclusive use licensed high power spectrum. It's really playing to the CCP's, Chinese Communist Party's playbook, right? They love high power exclusive use licensed spectrum that's controlled by three quasi-national entities in China, right? The three big mobile operators in China. It lends itself to their domestic surveillance program, and then through their influence of Huawei and ZTE, which are the big, Huawei is the biggest cellular infrastructure vendor on the planet. They are able to use those technologies to assist their foreign surveillance activities as well. So they don't really like unlicensed spectrum. In fact, there isn't really unlicensed spectrum per se in China. They have Wi-Fi, but it operates under a different access paradigm there. And they don't like the shared spectrum that we're doing with CBRS, because it decentralizes control, right? And they want to maintain tight control of everything. So that's one of the other things that I'm concerned about. I'm an old Marine, and I don't like the fact that we're kind of playing to their strengths.
I have to say, how many sci-fi movies have we watched? And I'm a huge sci-fi fan, where all of a sudden Morse code is very important because everything else has been knocked out. And so that redundancy that we've been talking about, not just reliability, and I'm sure the providers would say we provide a reliable service, but redundancy is something that diversity of options gives redundancy a much better kind of opportunity. So I would love to talk about kind of the discussion about healthcare concerns about 5G. I mean, there's just a lot of things that are going on out there, and you might say, oh, well, who's going to really think 5G will hurt you? No one thought that we would be having this discussion about vaccines, a couple years ago, but these things have a way of taking on a life of their own. And, the importance of understanding the technology. Mark, I just love what you said about training a workforce so that those innovators then have the opportunity and the tools to create. But we don't have time to talk about all that. And so I'm going to close by asking one simple question. And we'll start with you, Steve, then go to Mark, then Dave. We've got people who are probably like going to their dictionaries right now or Googling a lot of the phrases that you've used. What would you want people to take out of this discussion, and how can they help you be better advocates for rural America? If we can create opportunities for you to create a little army out here of advocates. And so, Steve?
Yeah, so I think, the discussion has certainly shown that spectrum is a vital resource for our country, and we need to understand it, and we need to make intelligent choices about it. We need to be thinking beyond the revenue model and looking at things like resiliency and redundancy and rural connectivity and education and all the things that that Spectrum, whether it's mobile or fixed, can enable, and the ways it can improve our lives. Maybe social media is not sort of the best example of ways to improve our lives these days, but it is something that everybody pays attention to. I would just say, be engaged. Communicate with your elected leaders. Organize yourselves. Meet your local providers, not the large cable companies, not the mobile companies, but the smaller companies in your rural communities, and get to know them and understand their business and offer ways that you can participate in the public process. That is one of the things that Spectrum is useful for is civic engagement. And I think that plus face-to-face meetings and knocking on doors and asking the hard questions is what consumers and businesses should be doing.
Terrific. And I'd ask you all to, at the end of your presentation, I'll go back to you, Steve, to give folks a place where they can learn more, where they can participate. If you have websites or organizations that you want to advance here.
So one, WISPA.org, that's WISPA.org, is the trade association that represents small rural broadband providers across the country. I hesitate to do this, but if you want to communicate with me directly, my email address is scoran, SCORAN, at lermancenter.com. That's LERMANSENTER.com. And I will happily return your notes.
Terrific. Thank you. Mark?
For me, the big takeaway is very much like Steve. As a small little rural school districts covering what I cover, I don't have a lot of power. But as a group, I've watched this in the communities I'm a part of in the Wi-Fi and the private cellular world. Is together we can make a change and go. This is value. Having these types of discussions, be willing to talk to our senators, to our elected officials, and go. This is something that is very useful to me. Being deeper understanding, not that this group is technical, but understanding that there is some stuff that you rely on every day. All of us use cellular technologies every day. All of us use Wi-Fi every day. These are things that are very much under threat by these types of bills, and the carriers that have the money and the lobbyists and all those things, they're the ones making the most noise about this. CBRS is a failure. We're not relying upon this. If you're using a WISP, a wireless ISP at home, you get your internet from a radio on your roof connected to a tower somewhere. You are very likely using either Wi-Fi or CBRS bands for that connection. And so this is very much could affect your internet at home and how you're connecting in the future. And so being aware of these issues, being willing to step up and go, this is a potential problem, and talk to your senators and your elected officials is, I think, the greatest way you can make a difference with this. In regard to organizations that I'm involved in, the Utah Education and Telehealth Network is obviously where I do my day job, but I'm a part of the Safer Buildings Coalition. We are advocating to get 911 inside of buildings for school safety, with the different safety and shootings and different attacks in schools. And so we're looking at 911 getting emergency communications in those buildings. ITDRC, as Dave talked about, they're a great organization as well. I'm not a member of theirs, but I've been privy to a lot of stuff they've been doing on getting this connectivity brought up after hurricanes, after tornadoes, after earthquakes, getting and restoring connectivity to communities that are in need after a disaster. And so I think those two organizations are very much in alignment with this group in getting connectivity where it's needed at the time when it's needed. And so that's that. So
terrific. Thank you so much. Dave, you get the final word.
Very quickly, I fully agree with Steve and Mark. The most important thing in terms of how this bill plays out, talk to your elected representatives, not just at the federal level, but state level as well. Let them know that, Wi-Fi and CBRS, are important to you as rural constituents. A lot of people on the Hill talk about how important rural America is. Well, okay, show us that rural America is important. Make sure that these bands are protected. And if the FCC opens up a new proceeding or even in this existing proceeding, weigh in and say, yeah, we don't want to see CBRS repurposed just for the carriers. It's important, the rural WISPs and rural farms and rural manufacturing continues to have this resources available. As Mark sort of alluded to, they always hear from the big carriers. It's rare that they hear from the rest of us, so we need to get those voices out. So really would encourage you to do that. In terms of resources for the future, SpectrumFuture.com, that's the organization I'm representing, Spectrum for the Future. We will continue fighting this fight. We'd love to have more people on board. And then ITDRC, which both Mark and I mentioned, is itdrc.org, and it's certainly worth checking out. And thank you again.
It almost has become kind of this knee jerk in rural America that, we need to have, bridge the digital divide. We need to, but then every time you have innovators like Mark and great policy thinkers, it's like one step forward, two steps back, because it doesn't seem to be supported by public policy. And I think that for a lot of years we have simply focused on getting financial resources to build the infrastructure, and we haven't really paid attention to these spectrum issues. And I think that's why this panel has been absolutely critically important, and we haven't even touched the surface of the complexities of all of this going forward. But I think there are resources for people out there to begin to think about what that world looks like going forward, whether it's going to come in satellites or, I keep thinking, back in the day when we thought that the only radio signal was AM, and then we discovered FM. We're going to discover and innovate, and to the extent that we can broaden the availability, which I think Dave presented some great discussion there in his PowerPoint, broaden the availability of spectrum and democratize it even further. But we've got to have adapters, and that's the most important message, I think, is that this argument that this has failed because there haven't been enough people who've adapted. Well, things don't happen overnight. They have to happen, and then what you do is you pull the rug out underneath those who do adapt and those who are, in fact, doing innovation and amazing work. And so let's fight for rural America. Let's fight for our position here, and let's fight for lower costs. I mean, when you have monopolistic, and people say, well, no, T-Mobile and Verizon and all these providers are pretty competitive with each other. Yeah, but there isn't a lot of variation in terms of how you can lower the costs. And I challenge everyone out there who says, oh, well, I say, remember when you would get the cell phone bill, or not the cell phone bill, but the landline bill from AT&T or from Ma Bell, whoever that happened to be, and you would say, man, that's expensive. Take a look at what you spend in communication today as a percentage of your budget, and think about, if you could cut that in half, what that would mean for families who struggle a little bit, families, and get the same level of service. And so this is all really critical. Thank you guys. You guys did a terrific job today. I think is laying this out, and I expect that at One Country Project, we're going to continue to have this discussion. We're going to continue to advocate for rural organizations like Mark's and Dave's and Steve's, and basically encourage the people that we can influence to participate, but also continue to educate. So thank you so much.